You're listening to the GSMA Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Programs podcast.
Welcome everyone to our pilot podcast series on innovation in the humanitarian space. This episode is a deep dive into issues surrounding gender and inclusivity. I'm Rosie, a market engagement manager for the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation program at the GSMA. Gender and inclusivity is one of our 5 core themes in the what we call M4H program. And for a bit of additional context, M4H is exploring how mobile-enabled solutions can reduce the gender gap in access to digital humanitarian services and enhance quality and accessibility for vulnerable segments of the population. This is a great opportunity to look at this topic because, as we know, forced migration and complex emergencies impact women, girls, men and boys very differently. This can be linked to differences in the vulnerabilities of each of those groups and other complex factors that impact vulnerability like disability, health, sexuality and age. We're here in northern Uganda in Gulu, visiting Kirandongo refugee settlement, and I'm delighted to be joined here with Claudia Simler, who's the COO of Refunite. Welcome, Claudia. Great to have you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Claudia, can you tell us a little bit about your work with Refunite?
Sure. So Refunite is short for Refugees United. We are a nonprofit foundation focusing on addressing the issue of refugee family separation. So specifically, we use digital platforms and tools to reconnect separated family members. We do this through a global online database where family members can register and search for their missing loved ones.
That's great. So you've been with Refunite for nearly 8 years. What is it about this topic and this work that's kept you so engaged?
Yeah, so specifically the issue of family separation is kind of an overlooked issue within the humanitarian space, and it is so because many other pressing challenges often come before the issue of reconnecting separated family members. But I do think that engaging with refugees on the ground and realizing what family means to them and their psychological and social well-being, I think that has been sort of a driving factor in my work. And I've had the pleasure over the years to really visit a lot of different refugee camps and settlements and engage with end users who have shared their stories. And you know, when you realize what the lack of access to family means and, you know, then bringing a solution to that problem, I think that has been a motivating driving force for our work, for my work.
Yeah, that's amazing. So when we're talking about solutions in humanitarian assistance, we know that it's designed and delivered with the primary objective of saving lives and alleviating suffering. And yet we still hear this kind of common argument that paying attention to gender issues is just not timely or practical in the field. And we know that UNHCR estimates around 75% of refugees are women, and that women are 14 times more likely to be impacted by the devastation of a complex emergency or a natural disaster. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your experience working on this topic with women refugees in particular.
Yeah, sure. So I think what we see across the sub-Saharan region where we work is still a very male-dominated family structure. And so we do see that with the work we do that is specifically mobile phone enabled, women are still sort of at a disadvantage when it comes to accessing different services. So men will still be in charge of a household. They will be the ones with access to a mobile phone, often the only one in the household. So it means effectively that more of our users are men than women, but it doesn't mean that the issue of, you know, family separation is less prevalent for women. And so from our perspective, there is definitely still a large gender gap when it comes to providing equal access to a service like ours, but also any service really that is provided through a digital platform or a mobile-based platform.
So when you're trying to target people, are there any specific subgroups that you think deserve additional attention? And how do you think mobile technology could support their inclusion?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's often difficult because a household will often have one mobile phone, and that mobile phone will be in the hands of the household male figure. And so, how do you bring programs to women or people who don't have cell phones? It's an infrastructure problem, but it's also a cultural problem. Mm-hmm. And it's a very hard one to tackle because at the end of the day, it's a question about changing those social norms around who gets access to information, who gets access to more power, if you will. What studies have shown specifically in this area, though, which I find interesting in the context of displacement, is that the very fact of being displaced often changes these cultural patterns of male domination within the household. So you will see sometimes refugee women being more entrepreneurial just because they have to in order for the family to survive. And that starts breaking down some of these entrenched social structures where the male is dominating a household. And so it's an interesting dynamic where you can kind of argue that in some respects, displacement actually might drive more inclusivity for women. But I think the access problem to mobile phones in and of themselves is also, of course, tied to income. And that's a tricky one too. So I think it's a multifaceted problem. And I think, there's not one silver bullet to really say what is going to drive more women to have mobile phones. But it's probably a good mix of, having more income, more disposable income. Also, again, literacy, becoming more educated in order to be able to benefit from these services. And then the cultural norms and power dynamics, whether that displacement effect will really sort of have a longer term impact on changing that is, it's an open question, I think.
So it sounds like you're saying access to mobile technology is really a challenge in some of these specific contexts. And at the same time, mobile phones and therefore mobile operators have a role to play in sort of empowering certain segments of refugee populations and providing livelihoods. Have I understood that correctly? That's your fundamental kind of belief that mobile technology has a critical role to play here?
I think mobile technology has a role to play when it comes to information access. Information is, often the key to a greater sense of empowerment. And so I think one of the key barriers is still, unless, let's say, women specifically are able to engage with that content that is available to them potentially through a mobile phone, they're still not going to benefit from it. So assuming the literacy levels are high enough to sort of read and meaningfully extract value from what they can access when it comes to services, I do think that mobile phones have a huge role to play. And I think specifically what we're seeing is that when women do have access to a mobile phone, and especially with all the new financial services that are available through mobile phones, it gives them much more power when it comes to making economic decisions for the family, for the household. They are the ones who can use mobile phones to pay for sanitation services or water or electricity. They can start saving via their mobile phone. So I do think mobile technology has a role to play, but it also implies a certain level of literacy and even technology proficiency, if you will, to truly and meaningfully engage with that mobile technology. So I think there is a lot of work still to be done in terms of how do we upskill those women at the very bottom when it comes to basic skills for them to truly take advantage. But once we get, even those groups up to a certain level, I do think mobile technology has sort of the power to unlock many more opportunities for women.
Yeah. And we know that when we engage with technology, it's very much gendered. And broadly speaking, the digital divide persists among low-income men and women more prevalently than it does in kind of higher income countries. So maybe I can just tell you about the GSMA's Connected Women programme, who have done some research recently around women in low and middle income countries who are 10% less likely to own a mobile phone on average. And the programme's recently published information that shows the main barriers to gender inclusion are around access, affordability, safety, usability, and sort of relevance as to what they're going to get on the platform, which very much echoes what you've just said around barriers to access and the challenges that are faced here. Do you see similar patterns within the refugee communities you're working with in terms of these barriers that the Connected Women programme's called out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's echoing some of what I've mentioned earlier. I think what we often see is that it will just be one person in each household having access to a mobile phone. With that said, other studies also show that displacement in and of itself can sometimes change these power structures and actually allowing women to do more than they would have done in their home countries. But I think at the end of the day, it is also just a socioeconomic issue, an issue of affordability. And so how much of it is cultural and just the one male person of the household owning a cell phone, how much is socioeconomic? I think it's probably a good mix.
Yeah, and are there any other barriers specifically that you've seen in your work generally?
Yeah, again, cultural and tied to income levels, disposable income. And so, even though now initiatives are coming out with, operators launching very cheap mobile phones, I believe MTN Uganda has just launched a $20 smartphone. So, of course, these types of initiatives will be really interesting to follow and see, well, does the affordability issue go away with $20 smartphones on the market? And I guess, looking at the adoption of those types of cheap smartphones will also be an indicator of how much of the issue is tied to just pure socioeconomic factors and how much of the issue is tied more to cultural norms around whether women should have access to more information. So I think that will be interesting to follow.
So we're here in northern Uganda. We know from UNHCR that Uganda hosts between 1 million and 1.4 million refugees. And there's been around a 30% increase since 2017. And I actually believe that that's going up ahead of the elections in Congo at the minute. So can you tell us a bit about, what we're doing here and maybe about, why I'm here as well?
Sure. So we've actually just launched a pilot project, which is allowing refugee populations to get connected to digital work through their mobile phones. It's a work where we collaborate with large tech companies to outsource their data work to refugees in Uganda. We believe that connecting refugees to dignified work is one of the best ways of empowering them and giving them access to a stream of income that they didn't have access to before. And so the pilot is really a test of how much can you over time change a refugee household's disposable income once they have access to more steady work than they've had access to before. We know that a lot of the refugees that are based in the settlements and even in the larger cities in Uganda don't really have any steady income. They hustle a lot. It's odd jobs and day jobs that really provides for what they can put on the table at night. So we believe if we can start including these refugee groups into the global gig economy, really, we think that can be quite transformative. And so obviously the pilot is also a test of how much you can do with mobile phones and how much you can achieve when it comes to doing meaningful work on a mobile phone. And we're already seeing some interesting results with our initial cohort of users where we see both young men and young women engaging with our service and finding it quite interesting. So yeah, that's what we do.
And so we were in the settlement yesterday doing a workshop, and it was great to see users being onboarded and trying out the new system. Do you see any specific challenges? Did you pick up on anything around getting more women engaged? Do you see anything specific that maybe we need to think about when trying to include more women refugees into this pilot?
Yeah, I think we're definitely sort of naturally seeing a great interest from young men and young men will then speak to their friends and bring more young men to us. And so I think we do need to just be careful in how we select our ambassadors on the ground, if you will. So I think we have some strong female figures within our first cohort of users, and I think just paying attention to them and leveraging their position within their respective refugee communities will be important to just make sure we have a balanced user base and also a balanced inclusion of refugee women into the work that we have them do.
Great. So if our listeners wanted to find out a bit more about Refunite, where should they go? How can they keep up to date with you?
Yeah, sure. So people can find Refunite's website, Twitter, Facebook, by searching for Refunite on the web. We're still working on getting more information on our latest digital and sort of financial inclusion project online, but that will be up there hopefully very soon, so people can follow also the digital employment part of what we do.
Great. So, we need to get on the road back to Kampala. So I'll just say thank you so much, Claudia, for your time and for talking to us. And to our listeners, if anyone wants to find out more information about the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation program at GSMA, you can go to www.gsma.com/M4H. Thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to the GSMA Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Programs podcast. Our mission is to accelerate the delivery and impact of digital humanitarian assistance. We aim to reach 6 million people with improved access to and use of life-enhancing mobile-enabled services during humanitarian and disaster preparedness, response, and recovery by 2021. The GSMA Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Program marks an evolution and expansion of the GSMA's disaster response work. The program is supported by the UK Department for International Development.